So now we're going to be talking about costs. And the first cost we're going to be talking about is total cost. Now, total cost is basically what it says, the total market value of all resources used to produce a good. Now, what we can do is we could break total costs into two different types of costs. One, fixed costs. These are costs that do not change with the rate of production. In other words, these costs are the same if you produce 0 units or if you produce the maximum output. Some examples of fixed costs could be rent. You pay rent if you produce nothing. You pay same rent if you maximize output within your facility. So these costs do not change with the rate of output. And of course, another type of cost are costs that do change with the rate of output. These are called variable costs. So as you increase output, these costs go up. Classic variable costs are raw materials, labor. If you want to produce more output, you need more labor, you need more raw materials. So these costs do change. So if we were to draw a nice little formula, that would be total cost equals fixed costs plus variable costs. So the change in total cost depends upon, of course, variable costs. And this is key. The total cost at an output rate of 0 is equal to your fixed cost. That makes sense because your variable cost when output Q is, sorry about that, fix that. When output is 0, right, total cost equals fixed costs. That's because variable cost is 0. That's a 0, by the way. So my eraser is not working here. So output rate of 0, total cost equals fixed cost. Now, let's look at this. First, start your analysis always at an output rate of 0. At an output rate of 0, your total cost is 120. And notice how your fixed cost is also 120. That's because your variable cost is 0. Once you know your fixed cost, you could fill that all the way down because that does not change with the rate of output. So the nice thing about this is you could start this process. If I give you your total cost and I give you your output, you could determine your fixed costs, then figure out all the other fixed costs. Then now you could figure out your variable cost by taking this number minus this number gives you this number. And you could do that for each rate of output. And graphing it is pretty straightforward. Graphing fixed costs is definitely straightforward. Remember, fixed costs, as you see here in this slide, fixed costs are 120, right? Well, since it doesn't change with the rate of output, it's going to be a straight line at 120. Now, variable cost does change. Now, fixed costs and variable costs equal total cost. And we can figure that out. Look at an output rate of 30. Your fixed costs are 120, right? And your variable costs are about 200. If you add them together, that's 320, which is going to be right about here. So that's going to be a point on your total cost curve. What about output rate of 15? Well, roughly fixed cost and variable costs are both equal at 120. That's going to be about 240 right there. Now, watch, when I graph the total cost line, that line should run through these two dots, and they certainly do. So that total cost line right here is simply your fixed cost plus your variable cost. And notice how total cost goes vertical right here, and so does variable cost. That's because you've reached your maximum output at 51 units here. So if you keep hiring workers, once you get to 51 units, you're not going to get any extra output. All you're going to be doing is increasing your costs, and that's why it goes vertical. Now, let's talk about another set of costs, average costs. These look at how costs change over an entire range of output. Sometimes these are called per unit costs. And this is pretty straightforward. All you're doing is taking your total cost at any rate of output and dividing it by that output. So it's total cost divided by Q. And the same thing goes with average fixed cost. You take your fixed costs and divide it by output. Now, one thing about average fixed costs, as you increase the rate of output, fixed costs stay the same, but average fixed costs fall, right? And so that this is something that sometimes confuses students because they know that fixed costs don't change when you change output, but average fixed costs do. It always falls. Average variable cost is variable cost divided by quantity. And you could figure out average total cost two ways. So ATC is a FC plus a VC, or you could figure out ATC by simply taking total cost divided by quantity. You'll get the same number. Now let's take a look again. Start at an output rate of 0. If I tell you your total cost, you know your fixed cost. Your fixed cost is 120. You take 120 and divide it by Q, and this is you're going to get here. So for example, let's look at 15. That's going to be 245, which is right here, divided by 15. And that's going to equal 8. For this one, 6, we're going to take 270, which is this one right here, and divide it by 20, which is this one right here, and that's going to give you 6. That's how you figure out your average fixed cost. Well, once you take your fixed costs and you subtract it from your total cost, you can figure out your variable cost. You take your variable cost, divide that by Q, and you can get your average variable cost. Now, you can figure out your average total cost by adding these two numbers together, or you could take your total cost and divide it by Q. And graphing it looks pretty straightforward. Notice how ATC's got this little kind of smiley face here. That's because ATC equals AFC plus ABC. And at the early rates of output, most of your average total cost are average fixed costs. And since average fixed cost is always falling, it's bringing down ATC. But as you increase output, ABC becomes a bigger and bigger part of ATC, and AVC is always rising. So this rising AVC eventually brings up ATC. Now we talked about how average fixed costs are always falling, and AVC is always rising. And that gives rise of this U-shaped average total cost curve. Now another thing is since your ATC has got this U-shape ATC, the bottom part here shows the rate of output right here. Q, this is Q by the way, and this is the costs. This shows the rate of output that minimizes your average costs. So this would be minimum ATC. It basically identifies the lowest possible opportunity cost to produce a product. Now, marginal cost, again, we've talked about this earlier last video. That's the change in total cost when you produce one more unit. Remember, marginal cost and average cost are two different ways of looking at things. Marginal cost looks at how costs have changed when you produce one more unit. Average cost looks at costs over an entire range of output. Now, so let's look at a nice little summary here. The output decision or production has to be based on not only on your ability to produce, but also on the costs of production. And costs go up quite rapidly once you approach your full capacity. And I've given, this is a nice little test that you can do on your own. Again, what I'm doing is I'm giving you output and I'm giving you most of your total cost. And so the way you would solve this is always look at an output rate of 0. Let me just erase this. Output rate of 0 right here, and look at your total cost. Since your total cost is 24, that means your fixed costs are 24. And you could now fill that in for all rates, 24, 24, 24, 24. And now you've got your total cost and you got your fixed cost. Well, if you take this number minus this number, it should give you your variable cost. So obviously 24 minus 24 is 0, right? 40 minus 24 or 1, that's going to give you what, 16, right? 74 minus 24, that's going to give you 54.50, right? And then 108 minus 24, so it's going to give you 84, right? Now here, notice you don't have total cost, but I did give you variable cost. So if you add these two, it should give you your total cost. And that's going to be 100 and 160, right? And then let's go back to output rate of 5. So with 220 minus 24, that's going to be 196. And then finally, 282 minus 24, that's 260, 258, right? 258. I hope I did my math right. Now, for your average cost, all you're going to be doing is you're going to take your total cost divided by Q. Your total cost is 40, your Q is 1, so that's going to be 40, right? Here, your total cost is 74, your Q is 2, so it's going to be 74 divided by 2, and so on. A VC is going to be your variable cost divided by quantity, and your AFC is going to be your fixed cost divided by quantity. Now, your marginal cost is going to be the change in total cost when you produce one more unit. And so it's going to look like this. See? This is good practice. Now, there's some practice problems in the back of the chapter, cost chapter, that I recommend that you go over too. But that's all for costs.